The member for Chifley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, without doubt one of the few things that nearly everyone in this place agrees upon is this, that the arrival of asylum seekers by sea presents a massive and unacceptable risk to both those making the journey and those forced to rescue asylum seekers who've met with misfortune because they've fallen foul of that risk. While there's major agreement about this, there is massive disagreement in finding a way forward to manage this risk. In an effort to burst open the deadlock that presents itself, the federal government brought together an eminent trio of Australians tasked with the objective of developing a series of policy proposals to help us deal with one of the most contentious areas of contemporary public policy. The expert panel was made up of Advocate Paris Aristotle AM, Professor Michael Lestrange AO, and was headed by former Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston. The report, while carried out in a tight time frame, was thoroughly thoughtful and considered. It canvassed a range of options to help us manage this exceptionally challenging issue, but it was underpinned, and its 22 recommendations were underpinned with a set of principles, and it urged policymakers to do the same, ensuring a transparent, consistent approach to policy development and management. If members of the public haven't read the report, the panel's report yet, I'd urge them to do so because it clearly lays out the scale and nature of the problem and then employs an incentive and disincentive approach to help deal with the issue. For example, the report recommended Australia's humanitarian intake be lifted to help those stuck in refugee camps to have their applications for asylum assessed quicker instead of risking a journey on a people smuggler's vessel. At the same time, the report recommended the application of a no advantage principle to ensure no benefits gained by sidestepping regular migration arrangements. Now, these quick examples illustrate what I referred to earlier about building incentive and disincentive within the way in which we deal with the dangers generated by people smugglers. What struck me by the report is that the breadth of its recommendations, founded upon fact and data, tried to come up with a set of workable arrangements on a tough issue. But it was also fair. It examined proposals put forward by government and examined options advocated by those opposite, and agreed that regional processing was a critical element in frustrating people smugglers and disrupting their trade, but it also looked at the opposition's proposal to tow back boats, but from my perspective it was heavily qualified and needed a number of strict conditions to be met. And again, from my view, the notion that those opposite would stop the boats by towing them back is both too simplistic and too dangerous to be taken seriously. It risks the lives of Australian Navy personnel, undermines the very thing we need to tackle a regional problem with, and that is regional cooperation. Our neighbours don't like this policy, they don't want a bar of it, and the Leader of the Opposition knows it, and it's why he stunningly failed to raise a policy initiative he rated as critical during his recent meeting with Indonesian President Yudhoyono. But you only need to contrast the dimensions and detail of the Houston report with the simplistic approach of some in this broader debate. In early September, the Coalition announced that if elected, it would simply return any asylum seeker from Sri Lanka and intercepted at sea without even assessing or determining their refugee claims. It was a breathtaking announcement for a range of reasons, not least of which there was absolutely no context provided as to why, out of all the nationalities of asylum seekers arriving here, Sri Lankans have been singled out by the Coalition. What's also noteworthy in this unfathomable hypocrisy is that we've had those opposite suddenly find voice becoming the vocal advocates of the Refugee Convention. It was why the opposition refused to back our agreement for regional processing with the Malaysian government, pointing out to the fact Malaysia wasn't a signatory to the convention and using such inflammatory rhetoric about a country that is a valued partner of ours that prompted Malaysia's Prime Minister to react to the nature of the opposition claims at CHOGM last year. It even saw Malaysia's High Commissioner to Australia, Salman Ahmed, write to every MP in August urging moderation in the way those opposite were tarnishing the standing of his nation through outrageously offensive rhetoric. But the convention became a point of principle for those opposite, despite the fact they would turn back boats to Indonesia, another non-signatory nation, and now they would turn back Sri Lankans to a country that is not a signatory to the convention. We have a situation where those opposite refuse to support a transfer agreement with Malaysia because it's not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but then seek to establish a transfer agreement with a country that is not a signatory, Sri Lanka. But it doesn't stop there, because refusing to even consider the application of a Sri Lankan seeking asylum and then returning them without regard to their safety on return flies in the face of the requirements of the Convention. The opposition has simply assumed every application made by anyone arriving here from Sri Lanka is false. they effectively preempt the assessment process, they carelessly prejudge, they potentially ignore the reform obligations under the very convention they've become such ardent defenders of. It's the type of policy that prompted the Human Rights Law Centre to write to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition who announced this policy to point out that besides contravening the convention, their policy would, I quote, be incompatible with the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and Australia's own Racial Discrimination Act. Why? Because in part they single out arrivals from one country, and in that process the policy has the effect of singling out one ethnic group from Sri Lanka, the Tamils. Now, it's worth pointing out that the opposition cited human rights concerns as a basis for refusing to support the agreement with Malaysia. Yet they seem to overlook that Sri Lankan Tamils seeking refuge have actually had their claims in Australia accepted due to a genuine fear of persecution, stemming from a long, brutal civil conflict that cost the lives of 100,000 Sinhalese and Tamil civilians between 1972 and 2009. While some may say that things are improving in Sri Lanka, there are some that would say there is still a very long way to go, and it's worthwhile pointing out that one of our closest allies, the United States, has welcomed UN resolutions carried earlier this year calling on Sri Lanka to credibly investigate war crimes alleged to have occurred during that bloody civil war. Further, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is on record as saying that Sri Lanka will only achieve lasting peace through a real reconciliation and accountability. It's disappointing the Sri Lankan government's refused to heed this resolution, claiming it needed to complete its own domestic investigations without interference from foreign powers. These human rights abuses that are said to have occurred during the Civil War are serious, especially at the tail end of the war in 2009, where some groups claim that up to 40,000 people died. These concerns persist today and will be the subject actually of briefings of parliamentarians that will be conducted as a result of work of the Australian Tamil Congress, who have invited Mr M.A. Sumanthiran, a member of Sri Lankan's largest democratically elected Tamil party, the Tamil National Alliance. Now, Mr Sumanthiran is in Australia, as I said, at the invitation of the Congress, and they will be highlighting the need for the Sri Lankan government, with the support of the international community, to properly embrace the need for accountability as a vehicle to reach enduring peace in a nation that's suffered so deeply. Now, taking this into account and considering how recent this terrible war was, there are some genuine concerns about persecution and safety, and it's why we've seen 647 permanent visas granted in 2010-11 under our humanitarian program, a relatively regular number considering 579 visas were granted in 08-09 and 689 visas in 2009-10. These aren't remarkably high, but for the people granted asylum, it means the world to them, and they've made tremendous Australian residents and then citizens. Many have made their home in Western Sydney within the electorates that I and my friend and colleague who's present here today, the member for Greenway, represent. I've had the pleasure of meeting many of them and I'm proud to represent them in this place. But given the relatively low numbers that have settled in Australia, the bulk within Victoria and then New South Wales, I'm simply at a loss to find the reasons driving the Coalition's policy in relation to Sri Lankans seeking refuge. It flies in the face of their position, stated in reference to the opposition to the agreement with Malaysia, that such agreements must only be entered in with signatories to the Convention. It also flies in the face of their position that such agreements must be made with regard to adequate human rights protections. There is no consistency in that approach. There is little logic in that approach. It is why I'm so deeply opposed to what they've put forward and what has driven me to submit this motion for the House's consideration. And it is up to the member for Canning, who follows me in this debate, and along with the member for Pearce, to outline why this proposal should not be labelled as grossly hypocritical and discriminatory. As opposed to that approach, the government bases its approach on evidence and to do so and manage our obligations consistent with the Convention. While we have, as I've outlined, accepted a modest number of people seeking asylum from Sri Lanka, we have and will return failed asylum seekers after a thorough assessment of their claim for protection. And into the future, as we implement the recommendations of the Houston Report, we will be able to do so in a transparent, understandable way, but with an unshakably firm determination to deny people smugglers the ability to profit from the desperation of others. I commend this resolution to the House.